The sun rose, and so did the whips. Its light was not warmth, but judgment. Each morning, it poured over the dunes like molten gold, burning flesh and bone alike. Beneath that merciless sky, the women of Israel awoke to another day of servitude, a cycle of exhaustion that began with dawn and ended only when darkness erased their shadows. They were slaves, but not by nature, by decree. By the will of Pharaoh, proclaimed son of the sun, their bodies became the gears that turned the empire's colossal heart. Their hands bled against the stone, shaping the monuments that would outlive them all. They mixed mud with straw, packed it into bricks, and carried those bricks beneath a heat that shimmered like fire over the desert floor. Every motion was dictated, every breath measured, every cry ignored, and still, the work did not stop. For in the kingdom of Egypt, to rest was to rebel, to stumble was to invite punishment, and to speak, even to whisper, was to challenge the will of the gods. Yet among them were women whose hearts refused silence, mothers, daughters, sisters, women who once sang in the green fields of Goshen, now reduced to echoes in the quarry of Pharaoh. Their names have been forgotten by history, but their suffering shaped its very foundations. Archaeologists tell us that the great storage cities of Pithom and Ramses rose from a mixture of clay and crushed limestone, bound together by water drawn from the Nile. But within that mixture also lies something else, something not found in any record, the sweat and tears of an enslaved people. 1,000,000 handprints pressed into the bricks of a civilization that was never meant to remember them. The overseers walked among them, whips coiled like serpents. Their voices sliced through the air, cold, practiced, merciless. They were the administrators of fear, the earthly reflection of Pharaoh's unyielding power. To them, pain was not cruelty, it was order, and the women of Israel, bent beneath their gaze, became instruments of a divine machine. As the desert wind howled across the plains, dust coated their lips and eyes, turning tears into mud. Some fainted beneath the weight of the stones. Some never rose again. When one fell, another was pulled from the line to take her place, as if life itself were a replaceable part of the empire's design. No tomb records their deaths. No papyrus preserves their names. The grand carvings of Egypt speak only of kings, of gods with falcon heads and golden crowns, never of the women whose backs bore the weight of those gods' monuments. Yet science, even in its cold precision, has begun to recover fragments of their truth. Microscopic analysis of ancient bricks reveals traces of human hair, fibers, and fingerprints, the marks of those who lived and labored under the sun that burned without mercy. Their DNA whispers from the dust, a testament not to glory, but to endurance. And that is where the story truly begins. Not with Pharaoh's conquests or the glitter of his tomb, but with the forgotten women who made them possible. They were the breath that built an empire, the pulse beneath its stone heart. And though the empire never learned their names, the wind still carries them, in the sands that sweep endlessly across Egypt's broken monuments. Look closely at those stones, and you will see more than geometry and perfection. You will see fingerprints, the smallest evidence of the greatest silence in history. Their suffering was not in vain, for from their chains, a prophecy began to stir. A story of deliverance, of one child set adrift on the Nile, and a people destined to rise. But for now, in this moment of blinding sun and endless labor, the empire stands, and the women of Israel endure beneath it, because that is what they were forced to do, and that is what history forgot to remember. Inside the halls of Pharaoh, silence carried weight. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than pain, a silence polished into the marble, echoing through corridors where even light bowed before power. Here the air itself belonged to the king. Every breath taken was permission granted. And for the women of Israel, there was no name, no face, no self, only ownership. They were called property of the crown, not wives, not servants, not prisoners, just property. To the nobles of Egypt, they were the spoils of dominion, living proof of Pharaoh's reach across deserts and nations. They were adornments of his victory, tokens of submission, carried not on banners, but in flesh and silence. The empire's triumph was not written only on stone, but on their bodies. Science tells us that power leaves traces, not only in monuments or weapons, but in the smallest residues of daily life. From the ruins of palace workshops, archaeologists have uncovered ivory combs, fragments of linen dyed with foreign pigments, jewelry shaped by unfamiliar hands. Objects once held by women who did not belong, women whose presence in these halls was both invisible and undeniable. They served wine in goblets of lapis and gold, yet could not drink from them. They danced in silence, for music was reserved for celebration, and there was nothing to celebrate. Their movements, measured and graceful, were offerings of obedience, gestures that mirrored the order of the heavens Pharaoh claimed to rule. To him, they were not people, but symbols, each one a reflection of his divine image, an earthly ornament of celestial authority. For in Egypt, Pharaoh was not merely king, he was Ra incarnate, the living sun. And as the sun owned the day, so he believed he owned every life that walked beneath it. Historians describe this age as the pinnacle of Egyptian civilization, a time of architecture, mathematics, and divine order. But beneath that brilliance lay a system of hierarchy so precise it was indistinguishable from religion itself. Every class, every role, every breath existed to sustain Pharaoh's illusion of eternity. And within that structure, the women of Israel stood at the lowest rung, not because they were weak, but because they were feared. Their beauty was foreign, their faith unbending, their presence a reminder that even slaves carried the seed of defiance. Pharaoh's fear was not of rebellion by arms, but rebellion by birth. Every child born to an Israelite woman was a threat, a future he could not control. So he turned them into possessions. To own the body was to silence the spirit. To brand them with the insignia of his house was to rewrite their existence. In the marble corridors of his palace, human life was not measured in years, but in usefulness. When their service ended, they simply disappeared, folded back into the dust of history. No inscription bears their names, no monument depicts their faces, yet the faint traces of their hands remain. Tiny fingerprints pressed into the walls of painted chambers, invisible until revealed by the light of modern science. To look upon those prints is to touch the truth of empire, that its splendor was built not only by devotion, but by domination. Every polished stone, every golden statue, every radiant mural was paid for in silence. And still within that silence, a heartbeat remained. In the shadow of Pharaoh's throne, one woman paused. Her jug trembled in her grasp. Dust clung to the tear sliding down her cheek. It was not a tear of weakness, but of memory, the last trace of a world where her name once mattered. That single tear has outlived empires, because empires fall and memory endures. And if history forgets their faces, the earth itself remembers their touch. For in the palace of Pharaoh, where the gods of Egypt reigned supreme, the women of Israel stood as living contradictions, proof that even in a world ruled by divinity, humanity cannot be fully erased. Their silence became their story. Their servitude became their testament. And across the centuries, their unseen suffering whispers a truth no empire could ever own, that no crown lasts forever. From dawn to dusk, they carried clay, mixing it with straw, sweat, and pain. The fields stretched for miles along the river's edge, where the water of the Nile met the dust of empire. Here, the women of Israel became part of a machine that never stopped turning. Every brick they molded was a fragment of Pharaoh's eternity, a small, heavy prayer to a God they did not believe in. The process was simple and cruelly efficient. Clay dredged from the river, straw cut from the harvest, bodies bent beneath the weight, hands pressing, shaping, stacking, and always the same rhythm: lift, move, drop, repeat. No song accompanied this labor, only the commands of overseers and the crack of a whip that divided silence from obedience. Archaeologists have found remnants of those very bricks, compressed with traces of straw, hair, and bone. Under microscopic light, the layers reveal more than materials. They reveal fingerprints, the imprints of the enslaved, women, children, the old, the forgotten. Each ridge and swirl is a fossil of endurance, a biological record of suffering embedded in architecture. It is one of history's most haunting ironies that the same civilization which perfected geometry, astronomy, and stone alignment also perfected the mathematics of human exhaustion. They measured not only stars and seasons, but the limits of muscle, hunger, and will. The Egyptian overseer was both engineer and enforcer. He calculated quotas like equations. How many bricks per hour? How many bodies per line? When one worker collapsed, the numbers did not change. The equation simply replaced her. When one fell, the record might as well say, another was dragged to take her place. It was not metaphor. It was system. In the afternoon heat, mirages danced over the fields. Bodies shimmered like ghosts against the horizon, their movements mechanical, stripped of rhythm or individuality. For the women of Israel, even pain lost its edge. It became routine. Their cries were not prayers anymore. They were signals, short bursts of sound exchanged between exhaustion and silence. Too common to move pity, too human to ignore completely. And yet, the monuments rose. Every slab of limestone, every column that reached for the heavens, was fed by their silence. It is easy now to marvel at the scale of Egypt's architecture, to call it genius, divine precision, eternal grandeur. But if you listen closely, beneath the echoes of the stone, you can hear the human cost, the heartbeat of those who built what they would never see completed. The sun above was both master and witness. It burned without mercy, branding the earth and the skin alike. The Nile offered water, but not salvation. Even in its reflection, the faces of the workers disappeared, distorted, erased. Some tried to remember the taste of freedom, the scent of rain in Goshen, the laughter of children now taken or lost. But memory, too, became a burden. To survive, they learned to forget. And yet something within them refused to die. Even in submission, there was a rhythm, faint, buried. The rhythm of a people who would not vanish, no matter how deep they were buried in labor and silence. In one of the excavations near modern-day Pyramesses, researchers uncovered a burial pit, unmarked, shallow, filled with broken bones and shards of clay. The carbon dating placed it precisely within the period of Israelite servitude. There were no hieroglyphs, no royal seals, only evidence of haste, of disposal. It was not a tomb, it was an ending. History calls them workers, but that word is too light for what they endured. They were engines of empire, living, breaking, replaced, forgotten, and yet their endurance achieved something no monument could, proof that the human spirit, though crushed, does not vanish. Look closely at the half-built temples that still stand today, their stones eroded by wind and time. The cracks that run through them are not accidents. They are the signatures of those who carried them. And through those cracks, the light still enters. It is said the empire was eternal. But eternity itself could not outlast the memory of those it tried to erase. The monuments remain, but so do the fingerprints, pressed into clay by hands that refuse to stop living, even as they fell. Fear is the shadow of every empire. And even Pharaoh, the god-king of Egypt, the son of Ra himself, was not free from it. He feared not armies, nor invasions, nor famine. He feared something smaller, quieter, something that grew in the dark, beyond the reach of his guards. He feared life. The women of Israel, enslaved, broken, voiceless, carried within them the one thing Egypt could not control, the power to create. Pharaoh watched their numbers rise like the stars over the desert. He saw in them not weakness, but the echo of a future that did not belong to him. In his palace, surrounded by gold and silence, fear took the shape of calculation. He called his scribes, his priests, his generals, and from their counsel came a decree, cold as the stone it was carved into. The Hebrew women, he said, are strong. They give birth even under hardship. If they rise, Egypt will fall. To preserve his crown, Pharaoh turned against the wombs of a nation. He ordered the midwives and women themselves to become instruments of extinction, to end what had not yet begun, to silence the first breath before it could fill the world. History records no resistance in that moment, only obedience and silence. But silence, as history teaches us, is never empty. The midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, bowed before Pharaoh. Their faces trembled, but their souls did not. When they returned to the women of Israel, they disobeyed the crown. They chose life. And through their defiance, the first sparks of deliverance were lit. In the dim light of the royal chamber, Pharaoh's fear deepened. For each command he gave, the people he sought to destroy only grew stronger. Fear, like shadow, feeds on what it cannot grasp. And Pharaoh, who had conquered nations, could not conquer the will of women. Archaeological records tell us that Egypt at this time stood at its peak, monuments expanding, armies thriving, trade routes stretching to the ends of the known world. Yet beneath that brilliance ran cracks invisible to the naked eye. Economic strain, unrest among laborers, and the quiet persistence of an enslaved people whose numbers could no longer be contained. The inscriptions on temple walls speak only of triumph, but science reveals the truth hidden beneath the paint. A society stretched thin, struggling to feed its own, while the population of Israelite slaves continued to multiply. For Pharaoh, it was mathematics, and mathematics, when tied to fear, becomes justification for cruelty. He called it order, but in truth it was desperation. An empire so vast, so powerful, undone by its own paranoia. In the torchlight, Pharaoh's hand slammed against the table, a sound that would echo through centuries. He had all the power in the world, yet none over destiny. The cry of a newborn, somewhere far beyond his palace, cut through the night. A sound small enough to be ignored, yet strong enough to shake the gods. That cry was not just a child's, it was prophecy, the first breath of rebellion. And though Pharaoh could silence thousands, he could not silence that sound. Because empires fear what they cannot kill. They fear what is born from love, faith, and survival. They fear what endures. And that was the true terror of Pharaoh. Not the strength of Israel's men, but the unyielding life within its women. For in their pain, life continued. And in that life, Egypt's downfall had already begun. Empires rise on cruelty and crumble beneath the weight of memory. The sun sets over Egypt. Its light, once a symbol of divine power, now bleeds across the dunes like a fading crown. The monuments that once pierced the heavens now stand fractured, half swallowed by the sands they once ruled. Stone has forgotten its builders, but the sand remembers. The wind that moves across these plains is older than any dynasty. It carries with it the whispers of mothers, daughters, and slaves. The countless voices of those who endured what no god should have allowed. Their cries were once drowned beneath the chants of priests and the marching of armies. Now they drift freely, stitched into the breath of the desert itself. Science calls this place an archaeological site, a matrix of stone, dust, and data. But beneath the calculations and carbon dates lies something less measurable, the residue of human will. Grains of sand infused with traces of ash, bone, and sweat. The smallest evidence that suffering leaves a chemical memory. Each handful of dust tells a story. Microscopic traces of copper from the tools they wielded. Fibers from the linen that bound their hands. Even fragments of DNA preserved in the dry breath of the desert. Modern analysis can reconstruct their labor, their diet, their age, but no instrument can measure what they carried within. Hope, endurance, faith. The things that refused to decay. The empire that silenced them believed itself eternal. Pharaoh declared that his name would outlast the stars, and yet the stars still burn, while his voice has turned to dust. The monuments that bore his glory crumble, grain by grain, their perfection undone by the very sand his slaves once walked upon. History does not mourn the powerful, it records them, but it remembers the powerless, quietly, faithfully, through the ruins they left behind. Because the story of civilization is not the story of kings, but of those who endured their reigns. Look closely, and you will find them here. Faint silhouettes of women walking across the horizon, their shadows stretching long against the dying light. They are not ghosts, but echoes, the memory of persistence cast in motion. Every step they take in this imagined dusk is a step carried forward through millennia, so that the world may remember what power tried to erase. Even now the desert is not silent. The wind hums in a low, eternal tone, a song older than language, older than empire. It whispers of survival. It tells us that memory is not fragile. It is elemental. It moves through sand, through air, through the spaces between history and myth. And so, as the light fades over the ruins of Egypt, we return to the truth that every empire must face. No monument stands forever. No name endures without compassion. And no power, however divine, can outlive the memory of those it sought to destroy. The women of Israel are gone from history's pages, but not from its fabric. Their endurance is the dust beneath our feet, the breath in the wind that shapes these shifting dunes. The sand remembers, not because it chooses to, but because it must. It is, after all, the last witness. And in its silence lies the final judgment, that greatness built on suffering will always return to dust.